William Marshal needs no introduction. He's the most famous knight in history. He served 4 kings, 5 if you include Henry the Young King. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. In 1166, William Marshal, a champion of the Norman tournament circuit, had returned to his homeland of Wiltshire after not visiting England for 8 years. Now a man in his early 20s, he had joined his uncle's retinue at the castle of Old Sarum, the Salisbury Minier. His uncle was Patrick, Earl of Salisbury, a seasoned veteran of the anarchy, a powerful man. Things were looking up for the Marshal, and over the next 2 years, he'd be living a life similar to that back in Tonkerville. The Minier itself numbered around 50 to 60 fully mailed knights. The best of the best.
Hey, I can see the pub from here.
Then, in 1168, the Salisbury Minier was called to arms to join King Henry II to put down some unrest on the continent. In previous years, while King Henry ruled England, he had relied on his mother, the famous Empress Matilda, to rule over Normandy. And this she did with a firm hand. But alas, at the age of 65, the Empress had passed away just the previous year, in 1167. Naturally, there was a power vacuum. Naturally, the French king, Louis VII, had exploited this. So naturally, King Henry had to travel to Normandy to knock some heads together. There was also some unrest in Aquitaine. And, because they were her lands by birthright, the Queen of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, would accompany them on the expedition. During the expedition, Patrick, Earl of Salisbury, would serve as the King's chief lieutenant. Right. Until now, William Marshal had only really experienced Normandy through the tournament circuit and the west country of England. Now, he was accompanying his uncle much further south, into the lands of Aquitaine, where they spoke a different dialect. Gone was the Languedoc of the French, in was the Languedoc of the Occitan Provence, the native language of the Queen. At the capital, Poitiers, the royal entourage stopped. There, our Marshal is said to have been amazed, for this was pretty much the centre of culture on the continent, filled with troubadours and jongleurs, part of the customs of these provincial lands, the city of chivalry. But the lands themselves were far from that romantic dream. The vassals were stubborn and reluctant to be vassals of some northern king, namely Henry. So southern lands like Poitou and Angoulême were firm in their resistance. When it came to Poitou, Eleanor may have been the ruler there, ruling from the capital at Poitiers, but the domain was overrun by the Lusignan brothers, Geoffroy and Guy, who were currently raiding Henry's lands. It was the Lusignan household who were about to feel Henry's wrath. And here at Poitou was where William Marshal got his second taste of real military action. And here the king was more interested with delivering a hammer blow to the rebels than the codes of chivalry. So I will introduce the medieval concept of chevauchée, one of the most brutal tools at a king's disposal. A horrid tactic designed to strike at the heart of the enemy territory and spread terror throughout the populace. Packs of horsemen would conduct vicious lightning raids, scorched earth tactics. Here, Earl Patrick, thus the Salisbury Minier, were given the job of chevauchés. They destroyed villages, ruined crop, they raided the lands. The theory is thus: when the poorest can no longer reap the harvest, they cannot feed the castles. Entire families died. But as cruel as it was efficient, effective, and worked. This conflict lasted less than a month. And it is unrecorded what the Marshal thought of all this. His histories brush it all out. Though there was little he could do in his defence, these were orders from the king. And the Lusignans paid dearly for their insolence. Of course, the king didn't rule his kingdom alone. No, he and his queen ruled very much as a power couple. So while Henry had the strategy and the military might, Eleanor had the diplomacy. And now that the king had subdued the region, the queen steps in to bring order. Before King Henry rides north for peace talks with his rival Louis VII of France, he makes Earl Patrick of Salisbury the Queen's lieutenant, while she resided at her capital at Poitiers. And in April 1168, just weeks later, we can place the Queen touring her domains at Poitou, along with Patrick of Salisbury and the Salisbury Minier. I'll paint the scene. The royal entourage is passing through the deeply wooded lands, heading north to Queen Eleanor's castle at Poitiers. As to the exact nature of the journey, we have little idea outside of general diplomacy with their vassals. What we do know is that things were peaceful around this time following Henry's brief war, and there were no threats. Hence, the Salisbury Minier, who were tasked to guard the Queen, were not wearing armour. The entourage was marching through the woodland trail in a column formation, and one of the men guarding the Queen was William Marshal. Then chaos erupted as an ambush led by the two Lusignan brothers, Geoffroy and Guy, fell upon the royal entourage. A heavily armoured foe in full mail pitted against the unarmoured convoy. Their motive was most likely revenge to what horrors the English king had inflicted upon their lands, and the Queen herself would fetch a nice ransom price. Immediately, Earl Patrick, upon realising he was under attack, made it his duty to get Queen Eleanor to the safety of the castle at nearby Poitiers. The attackers had to be held up as long as possible while the Queen raced towards the castle. While barking his commands, the unarmoured Earl Patrick demanded his warhorse, and while it was being prepared, rushed into the oncoming attackers with a handful of men. William Marshal appears to have held back with the rest of the Minier, who were hurriedly donning their armour, while the Lusignan troops struggled to bully past Patrick's brutal counterstrike. Then disaster struck when the unarmoured Earl tried to switch to his destrier warhorse. He was separated from the rest and ran through from behind, impaled by a lance from an unnamed Lusignan knight. Earl Patrick died on the spot. Among this chaos rose William Marshal. He had witnessed this strike with his own eyes and blamed himself for not being able to prevent what he claimed was a deliberate assassination. Wearing only his mail shirt and little else in the way of armour, the Marshal mounted his warhorse in a blind rage and charged headlong, lance lowered, undaunted. It is said that the Marshal fought with fury that day, cutting down the foe like a lion unleashed, slaying both man and beast. A starving lion ripping into his prey. When his lance broke, he drew his sword. When his horse fell beneath him, he fought on foot. He was soon getting the attention of the Lusignan knights, who flocked over to him. At this stage in the battle, it was pretty much over. Those of the Salisbury menhirs who hadn't been slain or captured had fled to the castle. Marshal was on his own, a boar fighting a pack of wolves. Here he made his last stand, backed up against a hedge, keeping his enemies at bay at sword length. Alas, a lance came from behind, easily passing through the hedge, piercing the marshal's thigh and almost killing him. The champion fell, surrounded by his foes. But his job was successful, his duty complete. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was safe. Now, the Marshal isn't dead, far from it, but he is injured, quite seriously. He's also bound and tied, and made to ride a donkey back through the wooded trail. The Lusignan brothers and their menhirs were now outlaws, and they acted like it, moving from camp to camp, never staying in one spot, constantly on the run and evading the Queen's men. The Marshal's wounds were not treated, so he had to make his own field dressing out of the linen of his own clothing. But they were soon soaked with blood from the nasty wound on his thigh. He eventually manages to wangle some sackcloth and uses that to make a better dressing, to prevent infection. It still isn't great, but it's better than nothing. The Marshal's ordeal at the hands of the Lusignans was one of survival, and this injury could have easily turned gangrenous, ending his career as a knight, or worse, killing him. This may have been the case, if not for one of the nobles sympathetic to the Lusignans, who offered the outlawed brothers sanctuary. Here, the lady of the house took pity on poor Marshal, and even though the brothers were set against anyone tending to his wounds, this lady devised a plan. She hollowed out a loaf of bread and filled the inside with fresh linen bandages. These smuggled supplies probably saved his life. Before long, they were back in the woodland camps of Poitou. They would spend months evading capture, and William was captive all this time. Only 2 years ago, he was the tournament champion of the Le Mans tournament circuit. He thought he had landed on his feet with the Salisbury menhir, but now his lord was dead, and once again he was a lone knight with no master, a ronin to use a modern expression, assuming he made his way out of this horrid ordeal. As his wounds began to heal, the Lusignans were satisfied that their captive wouldn't try and flee. They allowed him more freedom around the camp. Now, the Lusignan menhirs liked to play a game called Aquitaine. Basically, the objective is to find a nice heavy stone or rock and throw it as far as possible, ideally after a good few drinks and a bit of gambling, to much hilarity. On one particular night, the Marshal, who is sitting round a fire, decides to join in with this. Remember, he's tall, he's muscular, he's strong. He manages to win the game, but at the cost of his health, as his wound opens again, setting back his recovery for a while longer. Well, that'll learn him. The Marshal's future was uncertain. As far as he's concerned, he's forgotten by all. Then, one day, after months of being held captive by the Lusignan outlaws and moving from camp to camp as normal, out of the blue, a messenger appears from Queen Eleanor. Apparently, she's more than willing to pay a healthy ransom for the captive, Marshal. We don't truly know her motives for this. Maybe she saw or heard of his heroics. Maybe she was securing the release of a host of captives. We don't know. No documentation survives. We only know that William Marshal was released from captivity and into the care of the Queen herself, much to his gratitude. And hereon, his life would change forever. So now at Château de Poitiers, he is given the best care in the kingdom, and all the time he needed to fully heal. And when he finally returned to service, he was recruited into the Queen's own retinue. What a promotion! According to his histories, the Marshal would spend the next 2 years in the employ of the Queen, touring the lands, looking for renown and glory, fame and fortune. Though it's unclear what is meant by this, and has been suggested that he may have returned to the tournament circuit during this time. But there is another theory, as the trouble with the Lusignan brothers had still not been resolved, and the scallywags were still on the run, outlaws to the last. The next year, 1169, they were finally defeated, but the two knights themselves, Geoffroy and Guy, were still nowhere to be seen. Yet, this is hardly a war. The Queen is hardly using all her manpower in finding two scallywags hiding in the woodland of Aquitaine. Maybe William Marshal did rejoin the tournament circuit after all. Probably why these 2 years were omitted, as fun and games in Normandy, while he's supposed to be the Queen's man, wasn't a good look. Especially as King Henry wasn't a fan of tournaments. Over in England, he's banned them. So we don't really know. And as for the Lusignans, they pretty much fade out around this time. Banned from Poitou. Well, one of them does anyway, Geoffroy. Because in case you're wondering why I'm using stills from the movie Kingdom of Heaven, well, it's because this is the very chap from the movie. No, not Martin Sokus. Guy de Lusignan. The very Guy de Lusignan responsible for slaying the Patrick of Salisbury. In the movie he's called Guy, it's just how you pronounce it. One day, after wandering throughout Europe, he'll make his way to the Holy Land. He'll become the King of Jerusalem. He'll marry the sister of the famous leper king, Baldwin IV. He'll lose the Battle of Hattin, lose the Kingdom of Heaven, and end up as Lord of Cyprus. Though he was never a Knights Templar. He was a regular knight from Poitou. Still, great movie. Back to the Marshal. By 1170, William had risen to great prominence in the entourage of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, and in the summer of that year he accompanied her to England, where she travelled to London for the coronation of her son, young Henry. Now, her husband, King Henry II, was very much alive. This is a Frankish custom, where the heir apparent is crowned alongside the current king, thus preventing controversies over succession. And if Henry I would have observed this, there would have been no anarchy. Matilda would have simply become queen. Over in France, the Capetian kings all practiced this. Also, Henry was clearly spooked by a storm which racked his fleet as he crossed the Channel in the March of that year, 1170. 400 souls drowned in the waters, and the king barely escaped. He must have felt he needed to secure his succession. He and the kingdom could not afford another anarchy. So, in the June of 1170, the 15-year-old lad was crowned Henry the Young King, and was to rule alongside his father, a strapping young lad who was promising to be a formidable knight, also highly educated, having been brought up in the school of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Beckett, though recently the king and the archbishop had become pretty much estranged. William Marshal was most likely alongside Queen Eleanor during the ceremony. His histories recall the sheer opulence of the event, and by the time they were done, the crown of England was secure. Young Henry and his wife Marguerite would one day rule the Angevin Empire. This done, the old king, as he was jokingly named, despite being only 40, sailed back over the Channel to Normandy. There he planned to patch things up with the Archbishop, Thomas Beckett. And while the king was gone, Henry the young king would rule England in his absence, only for a few months, but it would give him a taste. The old king also gives William Marshal a promotion. He is no longer just a knight in a queen's entourage. Now he's elevated to the young king's tutor at arms. He's a part of the lads' Minier, a party of merely 5 men, but a highly esteemed role nonetheless. The Marshal's going up in the world. Because, in a nutshell, the Marshal is now the young king's right-hand man. Take in mind also that the Marshal is only in his mid-20s. He's no seasoned veteran of many campaigns. It's a clear testament to his level of skill, which was unrivalled. The accounts where he fights multiple opponents don't seem to be far-fetched. As far as the old king's concerned, who is a seasoned veteran, William Marshal's the best of the best. Queen Eleanor, no doubt, put a good word in also. The Marshal and the young king appear to have formed a good friendship. The two were inseparable. The young king even takes up the Marshal's ideals of the cult of chivalry. And, within a month, the long feud between King Henry II and Thomas Beckett was at an end. The two men made peace with each other. After all these years, the Archbishop was allowed to return to England. Though fate herself hadn't made peace with the king, and seemed determined to get him. Now Henry II is stricken with a fever that just doesn't go away, so remains longer in Normandy, meaning the Marshal remains longer in the courts of the young king, who is in charge of England. And it's quite bad for the old king. He even draws up a will. He made funeral plans. Many actually think that the king is at death's door. Some even think he's dead. So you can just imagine what the mood was like back in England. Was the young king king? Was the old king alive? I mean, Henry could arrive back in the kingdom at any moment. But there must have also been preparations in the royal household to install the 15-year-old lad as the new King of England, should the worst be confirmed true. But before the reign of the theoretical Henry III happened, the old king was confirmed to be alive and well over in Normandy. After a brief nerve-wracking period of uncertainty, the kingdom was back to normal. Though instead of returning back to England, he buggers off to Aquitaine to see St Mary of Roquemondeur. He makes a 300-mile pilgrimage to the statue known as the Black Madonna. So I think it's safe to say that old Henry has got a little bit better. But worse was to come, as on the 29th of December, 1170, tragedy occurred, when 4 fully armoured knights stormed into Canterbury Cathedral and without a shred of mercy slew the Archbishop, Thomas Beckett, at the altar where he stood. An event that not only shocked the king to the core, but would haunt him for the rest of his life. But why? Well, apparently, during the Christmas court, the king was complaining about Beckett's disobedience, and the 4 knights had assumed it was a command, crossed the Channel, and headed to Canterbury to carry out their evil deed. We know these words as, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" Words he never directly said, but words that certainly give the gist. Either way, the Archbishop was dead, killed in his own church at his own altar. And to this day, where he was murdered is marked in stone. And where in life he was a controversial figure. In death, Thomas Beckett was a martyr. Just 4 years later, he'd be made a saint. And his feast day is the 29th of December. What this meant for William Marshal is that what is supposed to be the young king running the kingdom for a few months to give him some experience now turns into 2 years, because the old king is trying to mend the damage done. He's penitent. He cannot lose the support of the church. But anyway, all the while, the Marshal was teaching young Henry the arts of martial combat, the sword, the lance. The lad, now 16, had promise. He was taking to running the kingdom like a duck to water. The only problem he faced was finance. As he was wild, he liked to spend, most likely taking the chivalric ideal of largesse too far. He was a spendthrift. In later years, he'd be accused of incompetence and carelessness, but all this is written with hindsight. In reality, he couldn't have been that bad at running things, because in 1171 he hops over to Normandy to hold the Christmas court in Bayeux, a truly opulent affair that actually got quite silly. For instance, the name William was a highly popular name, so when a drunken William St. John declared loudly that only men named William can sit with the king, this was obeyed. But over 100 knights still remained. That's how many Willies there were. Always quite a lot of Willies. In 1172, things were going well in the kingdom, and at the young king's side was the Marshal, during every step of the way. Also that year, the French king, Louis VII, suggested that the young king should have a second coronation, one which his wife could attend to truly affirm things, basically to get her crown too. And this was conducted by the Archbishop of Rouen at Winchester Cathedral. So now there's no doubt in anyone's eyes, England or France, that young Henry was the true heir apparent. Not Richard, not Geoffrey, and certainly not John. I know over the past few minutes the focus has left the Marshal, instead falling on Henry the Young King. But I'd argue that you cannot tell the story of William Marshal without telling the story of the kings he served under, as he's very much the king's man. During the absence of the old king in England, young Henry is getting used to this kind of power. And it is clear that he's getting pushed by the barons to vie for an equal share of the throne, as currently he's only king in name only. His father, Henry II, doesn't share power. He clings to it. The other sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, were far too young to have really wished for any power. But now Richard and Geoffrey are older, they are given Aquitaine and Brittany. But John, he's the Lackland, given bugger all. Of course, the old king still gets to hog all the power. For instance, even though his son young Henry is the nominal Count of Anjou, he has no power there whatsoever. It all goes to his father, Henry II. So now we can see how all the focus is on the 17-year-old young king, a part of the cult of chivalry, a knight through and through, trained by the best. But a hungry hawk often turns on its master, and by November 1172, trouble was already brewing. That November, the young king had travelled with his entourage to, of all places, Paris, France. Yes, obviously Paris is in France. I only mentioned it for the emphasis, as it is highly unusual for an English monarch at this time to be anywhere near France. Young Henry is meeting with the king there, Louis VII. The French king absolutely adored young Henry and his wife. He even considered them his own children, as far as his affection was concerned. Then the entourage was in Normandy for Christmas. Right. And early the next year, 1173, Henry II, the old king, summoned his wife, Eleanor, and all 4 sons to his court in Limousin, in Aquitaine. It was supposed to enforce the unification of the Angevin Empire. That was clearly the intention. And here, the old king grants his 5-year-old son, John, lands. These include Mirabeau and Chinon, castles that belonged to young Henry. Outraged, the young king rejects this, and he demands the power denied to him. The old king can hand him Anjou, Normandy, or England. He can take his pick. Of course, this gets nowhere. He's arguing with a tyrant. Soon, rumours emerge that the king's other teenage sons, Richard and Geoffrey, were also siding with the rebellious young king. Worse, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was most likely the ringleader. Still, these are rumours, and Henry II appears to have been cool-headed. After all, he and his queen were a power couple. Right, so leaving Richard, John and Geoffrey in the care of Eleanor, Henry II goes on a hunting trip with his eldest son, Henry the Young King, to cool the air a little. Or at least that's what the chronicles say, as it is very unclear to what's going on. Before Henry II embarks on his hunting trip, he readies his castles for war. And at some point, the young king must have known that this was no hunting trip. Instead, he'll be in for a right wigging, a dressing down. Or worse, we all know what happened to William Rufus, the king who died in an accident during another hunting trip. Would his father do this to him? Henry needed to get out of this situation fast. Like I say, it's unclear to what is going on. Right, let's bring the Marshal back in, as he was most certainly there when this huge bust-up was occurring, being part of the young king's meunier, his household knights, no doubt part of this so-called hunting trip, escorting the old king north. The Marshal, the knight, so loyal to the crown who had given him everything. Was he now going to participate in open rebellion against the crown? We don't know what the Marshal was thinking during all this. All we do know is that when the kings, both old and young, reached the fortress at Chinon, young Henry took off with flight, escaping the clutches of his overbearing father. With him were his privata familia, the most closest of his family, including his wife and servants. Also his meunier, which included the Marshal, but unfortunately, in the chaos, poor Marguerite, the young king's wife, was left behind. But once away from the fortress at Chinon, Henry opened his rebellion against his father. What happens next will set the course of William Marshal's mindset going forward. One of undying loyalty to his lord, as Henry II is recalling all knights and retainers to his castle at Chinon. War is breaking out, and young Henry does the same, a call to arms to all of his loyal followers. Where does the Marshal stand? Well, he remains with his lord, the young king, as they make their flight to France. You see, the young lad, as courageous as he was, could not hope to take on his formidable father all by himself. He'll need allies. And he had many friends in the courts of Louis VII, including the French king himself. So, here we are. The Marshal is now a rebel in a foreign land, under a foreign king. Though he's not serving under Louis, he's still a part of young Henry's meunier. So we can't count Louis of France as one of the kings that the Marshal serves under. As I said in the intro, he's going to serve under a few. But back in Chinon, Henry II creates a list of diabolical traitors who are committing treason against the crown. The meunier is named, Marshal's name among them.